climate change could impact how many passengers airlines could fly or even how many destinations you can travel to. That's according to new research undertaken by scientists and engineers, including Professor Paul Williams from the University of Reading. Let's get more on this research. Paul is with me right now. Hello to you there, Paul.
Hi, Phil.
OK, so you've been looking back in the past, decades of research. What impact have you found when it comes to climate change due to flights?
Yes, it's a little known consequence of climate change, but as the air gets warmer, it's expanding and the air molecules are getting further apart. And this is, of course, why warm air rises. It's because it's lighter. But as the air molecules get spaced further apart, what that means for a plane that's trying to take off is that the air molecules that are giving it the lift and pushing it upwards, there aren't as many of those molecules. And so the lift force is reduced. And just to give you some numbers, for every 3 degrees Celsius rise in air temperature, the lift is reduced by 1%. And that's equivalent to raising the altitude of the airport by about 100 metres. And it just makes it harder for the plane to get off the ground.
And must use more fuel.
And there's a few things that could happen. They could take passengers off or cargo off to reduce the weight of the plane. That's one thing that could be done. And we found that at one of we looked at the Airbus A320 as a sort of classic medium-sized plane. And at one of the airports we looked at, its maximum takeoff weight has been reduced by nearly 4,000 kilograms in the past 30 years. And that's equivalent to the weight of 38 passengers and their luggage, or over 1,000 kilometres worth of fuel. So an interesting choice there. Or they could lengthen the runway. That's another option, if that's a possibility, so that the plane can get up to a bit of a higher speed, and that can increase the lift force as well.
It's a fascinating piece of science. It really is, isn't it? I mean, and it is all to do with, was it Bernoulli, wasn't it? I seem to remember.
Oh, yes, the old fluid dynamics, yes.
Yeah. All right.
Don't ask me what it was. I don't know.
Air pressure, going over the top, travels further, all that stuff. But anyway,
exactly.
Looking at the way this works then, aren't the planes getting lighter anyway? I mean, a bit like cars, they're much lighter now because we're using different types of metals and materials to build the planes.
That is true, and that's a good thing. Quite what happens in future remains to be seen, though, because as we move towards electric planes, and we fully expect that in the next decade or so, it'll be usual for short-haul flights to be on electric planes. They need very large and very heavy batteries inside them to provide the power. So quite what's going to happen in future in terms of the mix of conventional airliners and electric planes and the weight going forward as well isn't at all clear at the moment.
All right, okay, because this when you're planning for the future, because obviously you want to be as environmentally friendly as possible, but at the same time people do need to travel. Almost certainly in the future we are going to have some way of travelling around the world, and hopefully it won't be to the detriment of the world in general and its climate. But would the immediate thing be cutting the number of passengers, or perhaps cutting the number of destinations, the number of flights, to perhaps make this easier?
Yes, those are options. I mean, there's a choice ahead of the airports that are affected here, and we've looked at 10 different airports in popular holiday destinations in Greece. I mean, if they can, and if there's support locally for this, they could extend the runways. We've calculated that the takeoff distance required has been increasing by nearly 3 metres every year, and of course in just 1 or 2 years that won't have very much of an effect. But over periods of decades or more, this really could require a longer runway, and of course that could be quite controversial with the locals, because we're talking about very beautiful, scenic, idyllic holiday destinations, and we don't necessarily want to tarmac those places over with runway if we can avoid it.
3 metres a year, that's quite something, isn't it, actually, when you actually see the science, but actually the figures are even more powerful, aren't they?
Yes, and we're the first people to do these detailed calculations. The effect that the temperatures have on takeoff conditions has been known about for some time. In fact, in the Middle East and the hotter countries in the world, it's common for them to schedule their long-haul departures either early in the morning or late in the evening, just to avoid the hottest part of the day. But actually the winds come into this as well, and we're the first people to combine the data on the temperatures and the winds and look at in the most detail that anyone has looked at before on how these changing climate parameters are modifying the conditions for aircraft to take off.
Well, if you're travelling from New York to London with Storm Kira, actually really fast, but I imagine the reverse was true. Trying to travel from London to New York that particular weekend, last weekend, and this coming weekend with Dennis on the way as well, that's turbulence, and I imagine an awful lot of hard work for the plane.
Yes, well, that was a record-breaking flight just this weekend, just gone. It didn't just slightly break the record by shaving a few minutes off it. It knocked a whole 17 minutes off the subsonic transatlantic flight crossing record, and we think that's because the jet stream is possibly speeding up as part of climate change. So there are many different ways, unexpected ways, that our changing climate could have unexpected consequences for the way that we travel by air in future.
Yes, and in the future, if we come up with, I always think we're going to have traffic in the future. It's just how they're powered, and it could be hydrogen, it could be electricity, it could be another way of getting around, which doesn't damage the environment. But the thing is the time frame for the climate to get back to normal. Then, so could we see quite a change the other way? That if we actually sort it out, actually flight becomes easier because the air is getting cooler.
Yes, I completely agree. We need aviation. It brings many benefits to society, as well as having the cost of the carbon emissions, of course, as well. And that's a difficult balancing act, with aviation both contributing to climate change and being affected by it in many different ways. Sea level rise flooding airports and more turbulence, and planes finding it harder to take off, and more lightning strikes for planes as well. That's one of that's been studied, and there's good evidence to support that as well going forward. So not necessarily good news if you're a nervous flyer going forward.
All right, well, really good to speak to you, Paul. Thank you very much indeed. Professor Paul Williams there from the University of Reading with that aviation research climate change.
BBC Radio Berkshire.
With Travel You Trust, every 15 minutes.